Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the sixth and final session of our Navigating the Employee Lifecycle series, presented by Human Resources Today and sponsored by Paycor. I'm Rebecca, the webinar coordinator of Human Resources Today, and I'm excited to bring you this session about C-suite succession planning. And this is as important as it gets. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Jim and Jen today in what will be an enlightening and also amusing conversation. We're recording the session in case you have to leave early at any point. Also, I want to thank you for joining us for the SHRM and HRCI approved webinar. All attendees that stay for the full webinar will receive an email with the activity ID after. Up next, and before we go any further, I want to thank Paycor for sponsoring the webinar series and helping us make this happen. It's an ongoing challenge to create a company that people want to work for and no one wants to leave. The good news is that you have a secret weapon. Strategically designed benefits package that considers the needs and wants of your diverse, multi-generational workforce can be the decisive path factor in recruiting and retaining talent. So thanks again, Paycor. Up next, let's get some technical things out of the way. Please feel free to ask questions during today's session. You can do so by submitting them into the questions panel on the right side of your screen. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. My lovely colleague Emily will be fielding your questions today. She'll be happy to answer any questions you might have, so pull up the questions panel and say hello to let Emily know that you're listening. Lastly, if you have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may wish to choose to dial in by phone. You could do so by selecting the More button in the upper right portion of your screen, and then select the Switch to Phone option. Up next, and what everyone's here for, I'm talking to Jim Bitterly and Jennifer Genosa. Jim is actually the managing partner, author, and joined EDSI in 2008 to lead its management consulting division. He has 34 years of corporate leadership and management consulting experience, which is amazing. Today, Jim is responsible for EDSI's national consulting operations. He's currently spearheading EDSI's efforts to help clients optimize their organizations to support growth, diversification, and cultural improvement. Jim is also the seasoned trainer and speaker. Prior to his consulting career, Jim spent 11 years as an executive with profit and loss responsibility, leading both domestic and international business units for multinational corporations such as Flint Inc. and Gibson Musical Instruments. He has his bachelor's degree from Michigan State and holds an MBA from the Kellogg School of Northwestern University. He's also the author of Unquitable, his newest book on Amazon. It is an amazing book with a lot of resources that you definitely need in human resources, and definitely have this in your toolkit. We also have Jen with us today. Jen Genosa is a senior consultant. She joined EDSI in 2012. She oversees the creation and implementation of various training and development programs, including succession planning. Her programs are utilized by senior management for skill and business process improvement. Her projects help businesses achieve KPIs such as profitability and on-time delivery. She's led both internal and external training initiatives involving training needs analysis, design, and implementation. She also has led value stream mapping sessions and presented at HR-related conferences on the topic about talent strategy. She's a certified strategic workforce planner by the Human Capital Institute. So today, Jim and Jen are the experts that are going to help you guys with C-suite. So without further ado, Jim and Jen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you, HR Today, for sponsoring this insightful webinar for today. So first, just one quick word about EDSI. We do practice what we preach. We're headquartered in Michigan, and last year we were the only company in our state to win all of the Best Places to Work awards in the state of Michigan. So it's something we're really proud of, and what we always do is we try to implement the talent strategies that we advise other organizations to implement in their own organization. So we like to try them out and make sure that they work. So with that, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the talent environment. I'm going to break it down into pre-COVID and post-COVID, right? Because we've seen radical changes in what's going on. Then we're going to talk about C-suite succession planning and why it's so critical. Jen is going to walk you through the key process steps. As Rebecca said, Jen is actually one of the few certified strategic workforce planners around the country. So we're going to let her walk you through those key process steps. I will then talk about common mistakes to avoid because I feel like we always learn more from our mistakes than our successes. And there are certainly many critical mistakes that we see on a regular basis as it pertains to succession planning at the C-level. And so we want to avoid those. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about buy-in. And then, of course, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So when we think about today's talent environment and we think about what's happened in the last 6 months, right? So let's think about if we go back to February and earlier of this year, we had unemployment rates that had gone from the Great Recession, right, to of around 10% down to recently under 4%, right? So phenomenally low unemployment rates. We also had a record number of unfilled positions in this country, well over 7 million unfilled positions, which is the highest number ever recorded. And what we really learned was it was the first time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that we had more jobs than we had qualified people to fill those jobs. So you as HR professionals have had a much harder job than possibly you've ever had before. And I'm not telling you anything new there, right? To make it also pretty complex, starting this year, it's the first time that we're really seeing, in many cases, 5 generations in a workforce. And what we know is that the difference between and among the generations continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So it makes it very complex to try to create a great environment within your organization where people are engaged and the morale is high and you have a great culture. So again, your jobs have become not only more difficult, but also more critical to the success of the organization that you're in. We also know that prior to the pandemic, we were having about 4 million plus baby boomers retiring every year. So we're losing a lot of our C-level folks and a lot of folks that are walking away with tons of skills, knowledge, and abilities. So then the pandemic struck, right? Out of Wuhan, China came COVID-19, and now we're all experiencing a very, very different work environment. Most of us are. And when we look at that, just looking at the jobless rate, right? I mean, what we saw by April of this year was unemployment at almost 15%. Now that number has come down, right? But we still have a very high unemployment rate. And we had a lot of money pumped into our economy. So, and that was artificial liquidity that was, from the CARES Act. What's going to happen is now that liquidity is evaporating, what we're going to see is we're going to see a number of businesses fail and downsize and struggle. So I anticipate that the unemployment rate, even though it has come down quite a bit, it's not going to get back to 3.8% anytime soon. So what we've also seen is we're seeing more boomers retire at a faster pace. A lot of boomers, I'm 57 years old. I'm at the tail end of the baby boom. A lot of them are in their late 50s and their 60s that are still working, and they are looking at the health risks associated with going back to work, and they're saying, hey, it's just not worth it. I'm too close to retirement, or I could retire. So we're seeing that 4 million per year number actually go up. We know that in the new world, right, we're leaning way more on technology than we did before. Our company has a little over 900 employees, and at one point, we had every single employee working from home, and we switched from having everybody working out of offices to everybody working from home in about 20 days. So as I'm sure you can appreciate, that was chaotic, and I'm sure you went through your own chaos going through the same thing in your organizations. But the biggest thing that we're all seeing is, like right now, right? Virtual meetings, um, doing things on Zoom, Teams, we're doing webinars, etc. So we're doing virtual conferences. So everything is changing. So when you think about it, the environment that we're operating in has changed. But one thing that hasn't changed at all is that C-suite succession planning is absolutely critical. And frankly, it might be more critical right now than ever before, simply because we are seeing a lot of the boomers and older C-level individuals, especially, saying, "Hey, you know what? It's time to hang up the spikes and get out onto the golf course instead of being in the office." So let's talk through what they're going to leave with, right? When we really think about high-level individuals in our organizations, they leave with many different things. The first thing that's really critical, they leave with relationships, right? They leave with customer relationships, they leave with vendor relationships, and employee relationships. I can't tell you how many times I've watched, even in my old organization, one of my key salespeople who turned 70 years old, and he retired on his 70th birthday. And he had some of the best, strongest relationships throughout our industry. And it was very, very, very difficult to replace him effectively. You get to your key C-level individuals, and they carry many, many relationships that sometimes it's not even, most people underestimate how valuable those relationships can be to your sales, to your vendors, etc. They leave with skills, right? Um, Skills are oftentimes harder to identify at the C level, but oftentimes it's relating to developing and communicating things like vision and culture, and plan, managing through crises, and motivating people, etc. So there are a number of skills that are unique to a number of C-level positions that we have to make sure we understand and be prepared to replace those skills when those individuals leave. Competitive knowledge. As Rebecca said, I spent 10 years at a company called Flint Inc., which is a large specialty chemical company. And now we sold the company, 19 years ago now. And it's interesting because when I left, when we sold the company, many of us left, many of the executive team like myself, we left and we walked away with tons of competitive knowledge and information. What's very interesting is today, I probably, back in that industry, I know CEOs and C-level individuals and virtually all of my major competitors from back in the day, right? And C-level individuals oftentimes know their competitors, not only in terms of how they behave, how they compete, but they oftentimes have people that they used to work with that are key individuals within those competitive organizations. And they talk. Really valuable knowledge is passed among those individuals. Institutional knowledge. I always laugh because my father-in-law worked for uh, the defense industry, and they built jet and rocket engines. And he was the second engineer hired by the company, and he was one of the 10 first employees. Today, the company has over 3,000 employees, right? And when he retired, he walked away with so much information about how the company worked, who the people were, where they had succeeded, where they had failed. He and I had a long discussion one night about what he knew. And I asked him at the end of that discussion, I said, George, um, did they ever sit down and do an interview with you to try to extract some of this information? And he looked at me kind of startled, and he's like, no, they never did. And I asked him, are there people that know all the same things you know? And he's like, well, no, not really. And it was interesting because it wasn't long after that he came to me and said that they had lost a very large contract, and it was related to the fact that they had made a mistake, and it was something that he said, had I been there, they never would have made that mistake because I knew it wouldn't work. And then he went on to explain technically why. Of course, I didn't understand anything he was saying, but but the institutional knowledge piece is huge. So with that, let's just talk. There's lots of types of succession planning, right? I mean, it can get very detailed, but there's three major categories, right? One is defined departure, and that is where we've identified a specific position or positions. There's emergency or interim succession planning, which is, oh my goodness, this C-level individual got sick, got hit by a bus, whatever it might be, and the next thing you know, you've got to make a change, or they were hired away by a competitor, right? And then there's ongoing succession, which is a process that should be going on all the time in all organizations. And they have something in common. At the leadership perspective, we have to make sure that we develop the individuals to step into C-level positions. Leadership development is so critical, and we're not talking about just leadership skills, but we're talking about all the knowledge, skills, and abilities that the prior leader had, so that we're transitioning those over. And then there's also the knowledge management. I talked about my father-in-law. He had a lot of knowledge up in his brain, and nobody ever tried to extract that from him. We need to make sure that we tie the development of the successors in not only with a development plan, but that we have knowledge management activities that we're going through to try to capture knowledge that's going to be departing and create it, put it into a format that can be used by the successors. So when I think about defined departures and that part of succession planning, which is largely what we're going to be talking about here in terms of C-level succession, oftentimes we're talking about transition of ownership in privately held companies or of key personnel. I do want to talk first about the leaders, the owners, because I spent, prior to my corporate days, I was at Deloitte Consulting and I did turnaround consulting. And for my first 10 years, not my first 10, my first 8 years at EDSI, I probably spent 80% of my time doing turnaround work. And I can tell you, and all of that work was with privately held companies. I can tell you that virtually every one of them had the company that began to fail or experience financial distress. You could relate it back to a transition in ownership and leadership, and that's where things started to go off kilter for those organizations. And when you really look at the ownership transition, when a second generation takes ownership and leadership of an organization, they fail 60% of the time. And when you think about it, most of those companies that transition from first to second generation have been around for 20, 30 years. So these aren't startup companies. These are mature companies that have had a history of ongoing business, right? So 60% is a huge number. It's even worse for third generation. The number is it's like 89.7% was the last study I saw. So it's about 90% of third generation leaders fail. You know, and when I was in the large chemical company, it was privately held. And the board of directors, they did have a board of directors, and they essentially mandated that the ownership bring in outside leadership because they were about to go from second to third generation. And the board recognized that the third generation was a very dangerous step, and that there weren't third generation leaders that were fit to be running the company. So it gets very, very dangerous at this point, and it becomes critical for the employees and the organization to make sure that we select a leader that's going to be successful as we go forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and she's going to walk us through the key process steps as we look at C-level succession planning.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Appreciate everyone being here today. And thanks to Jim and Rebecca for the intros and kind words. So these are the key process steps that you will need to know, and they're going to help guide you through the succession planning development process. There's 7 steps I'm going to go through with you all today, and these are the same steps that we also use with our clients. So step 1, identify critical positions. So you guys may have a specific person in mind when you begin this whole process, right? Some of you may even have someone in mind, and that's the reason you came here today to listen to us talk. So I actually kind of wanted to start with a poll question. The question is, how many people here today already do have a specific person in mind that they want to succession plan for? So I'm
Hey, I'm gonna launch it right now for you. Here we
awesome.
go. So the poll is now open. I have, do you guys have someone in mind that you need to develop a succession plan for? All right, we're gonna have this open for just a couple more seconds. And I do have a comment coming in, Jen, that's saying from Cheryl, she says, we have a succession plan for our CEO, but not for our other key players.
Okay, cool, interesting.
All right, so I'm gonna close the poll here and then I'm gonna share it.
Okay, so it looks like we've got a little, let's see, what's the percentage? 65% said they do. Okay, interesting. So it seems like most people here have someone specific in mind. I'm gonna hit you with another poll question. One more on this slide, I promise, that's it. So the next question is, how many of you all have started that succession planning process? Note here that today does not count. I'm glad you're here today. You sort of started it, but yeah, have you started something before today? That's the question I'm trying to ask here.
Perfect, so the poll is now open, Jen, and it's a yes or no answer. It's also anonymous for everyone that's answering, and there's no right or wrong answer. Okay, I'm gonna have this open for just about 5 more seconds, and I'm gonna close it here, and perfect. Here are the answers, Jen.
All right, so we've got a lot of work to do, I can see. So 60% said they have not started. All right, well, this is perfect timing then. You're here, you kind of know who you need a succession plan for, but you haven't started yet. So I'm gonna tell you how to get started and how to do it. So glad to see those answers. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so even if you guys do have someone in mind, you know, this is still a helpful exercise identifying the critical positions, especially also when you get into ongoing succession planning, right? So doing this is going to really help you uncover your company's critical roles and who in those roles might be leaving sooner than you thought. For instance, you might have Mary in sales, you might have Bob in engineering, and they're leaving in 6 to 18 months. These are critical positions, and them leaving could really impact your business, but you won't know until you do this step. So it might not be all C-suite people, right? But to begin this step, you want to first identify which positions are critical to the company. And you're going to do that by asking questions like, does this person drive revenue? Does this position, have decision-making power? And based on answers to these questions, you're going to rate that position on a criticality score of 1 to 5. You can see that in that first column there. And then for each person in these positions, you want to rate their retirement risk factor, which is based on the amount of time until that person is going to leave the position, also on a scale of 1 to 5. Then you're going to multiply these numbers together, and it gives you in the last column there the retirement risk criticality factor. So this really is going to help you show through the data where you need to focus your succession planning efforts. I can give you a better formula to calculate the retirement risk factor. There are some numbers that can go into that in a fancy Excel file. And I can give you more questions that you can, go through to figure out each position's criticality. So just let me know and I'll send you more information on that later. But as you can see in this example here, our CEO has the highest score. So we really want to focus our succession planning efforts on this position in our example. So moving on to step 2. Now that we know who we need to focus on, we need to figure out how to find the right person and how to train that person into the position, right? So we developed something really basic. It's called a success profile, which is basically a sheet designed to describe the talent needed for success in a critical role. I want to ask another poll question here. Who on this call today uses a form of success profiles at their company? So success profile, right? Just it's something designed that shows you, what kind of talent you need for success in your critical roles. So I think that poll's open and we can start voting. No, I love how you said that, Rebecca. No right or wrong answer, just kind of curious to see how many people use this at their company. Yes, no, or maybe you don't know.
Perfect. So I'm going to have this poll open for just another 5 more seconds here. And perfect. I'm going to close it and now share all the answers.
Okay, no. All right. So it seems like 64% of people said no, and so some people are, which is great. So just going back to our slides then. So success profiles are actually really helpful, and they're really great. So they can be used as a basis to create many other important documents like job descriptions, interview forms, training plans. So all these documents work together and they're built off of each other and built off of that basic success profile. So let's talk a little bit more about success profile. So when you start to develop it, you want to think about what would foster success in that position, not only now, but in the future. And when you do this, you're always going to want to think about it in terms of the position, not the person in the role right now. So there's 4 things we want to consider when developing a success profile. I'm going to go through those quickly. The first is knowledge. So technical and professional information is important. That's important to have in that position, right? Example for our CEO would be client acquisition strategies or cross-cultural differences. And then we have skills or competencies, which are a cluster of abilities performed. Example for our CEO would be decision-making or coaching. And then we have experience. So this is education and work achievements. Could be led a sales team or started up an organization. And lastly, we have behavior. So this is personal dispositions, emotional intelligence, character, leadership disposition. You're probably going to want to use a scientifically validated personality test here. I know our organization does that. I know a lot of organizations do. They're awesome. And this is really going to help you find that really perfect fit here, especially for your C-suite roles. It's more important, right? So final and critical note here is to gather your info from a variety of sources. If you ask the incumbent to help you build out the success profile for their position, they're naturally going to speak in terms of what they currently do, and they're going to, not really focus as much as future needs, which is understandable. And you want to gather data from other leaders and colleagues of that person, and even add in organizational goals, and you will have a very well-rounded success profile. All right, let's move on to step 3. This step involves evaluating future incumbents for this position. So this is where it gets fun. But now you can actually assess your incumbents against your data-driven success profile, which is going to relieve uncertainty and stress, and you're going to feel really good about, evaluating your incumbents. So, so if we click here, thank you. So you're going to take each item from your success profile that you created, your knowledge, experience, skills, and behaviors, and you're going to rate how important they are on a scale of 1 to 5 for someone to be able to perform that in this role. Some items are going to be more important than others, right? And this right here is your desired level you can see in that column there. And then you're going to rate your potential incumbents' actual level so you can identify the gap in their ability. So each item you have will have a positive or negative gap score. They're going to be better at that skill, or they're not, they're going to be worse at performing that skill. And at the end, you're going to see at the bottom there a total gap score, which you can use as a final score to evaluate all of your candidates, right? Just comparing the gap score, easy peasy, right? But the lower the score, the better your candidate fit is. The higher the gap number, the more training that person needs to be successful in that position, okay? So let's move on to step 4, moving forward. So after evaluating and comparing all your gap scores and picking the most qualified candidate that you can feel great about, you can create a training plan based on your new incumbent's skill gap. So here's just a little example of what that might look like. You have your success factor goal. So that's that, knowledge, experience, or behavior that needs improving. Your learning activity, examples include job shadowing, on-the-job training, maybe even a college course, joining a networking group, maybe a little bit difficult now today, self-study, or maybe even, having a mentoring relationship with someone. You can put in a goal date, you can have comments and status notes. Basically, that is showing that this is a living document you can use, and have check-ins on to see how this incumbent skills and knowledge and experience, how they are progressing. Okay, so let's move on to step 5. So in this step, our goal is to capture critical knowledge before it leaves the organization. Jim was talking about this previously. We have another poll question, which is, how would you rate your company's history of capturing critical knowledge before it leaves your organization? I think we did a scale of 1 to 5 here. So rate your organization's ability to capture knowledge before it leaves. No right or wrong answer, but just curious to see how everyone thinks they're performing on this.
Perfect. And the poll is now open. I'm going to have it open for probably another 15 seconds here. I know it's kind of a question that makes you, kind of have to dig a little bit deeper for.
That's true.
And so far in the lead, Jen, is 3. People have been rating 3.
In the middle, okay.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have this open for just another 10 seconds here. The low score is 1. Is that correct, Jen?
Yes.
Okay, and then the high score is 5. Perfect. And okay, I'm going to close it here. And here are the results.
All right, yeah, so right in the middle there, it looks like, or maybe even, people, yeah, so in the middle, and then we've got some 1s and 2s as well. So, not as many people rating themselves a 4 or a 5. So definitely seems like some tips that I'm going to give you on how to capture knowledge before it leaves would be helpful. So let's go back to that, and I will share that information with you. So it looks a little different, capturing knowledge, depending on what type of succession planning you're doing. So if we're doing ongoing succession planning, you're going to want to use this formula here, retirement risk factor times position criticality to find a total knowledge loss risk. And that will help you find the most critical knowledge and any people in those positions who might be leaving the organization. So that will help you figure out, using this formula, will help you figure out where you need to focus your knowledge capture efforts on. In C-suite succession planning, you might know whose knowledge you want to capture already, right? So you can kind of move forward to the next step. So let's look at number 6, step 6, moving on, which is actually starting to capture at-risk knowledge. And it begins with an initial discovery interview. So it's called a knowledge loss risk assessment. And if anyone wants to see what that is, an interview sheet with a bunch of questions on it, okay, that you can ask someone. So if anyone wants to see that, I can send you an example, so let me know. So this interview helps identify the main areas of knowledge that should receive the focus of deeper knowledge capture efforts. So after you've conducted that interview, you can identify the areas of knowledge you need to focus on capturing. And some methods of capturing knowledge, I wanted to give you a few of them, are creating process maps and creating documented processes, step 1, step 2, step 3. This is how we do something at our organization. Creating knowledge maps, creating knowledge inventories, job aids. Simple job aids are a way to capture knowledge, a practical way to capture knowledge. Decision trees are also a way that you can actually capture knowledge. If anyone wants to see examples of these really practical ways to capture knowledge, I can also send them to you, so let me know. All right, and then last but not least, we have step 7. So this is our final step. It's creating the master plan. So for C-suite succession planning, your master implementation plan is probably going to be focused on things that we've already talked about together today, which are creating that success profile for your position, very important. Picking the right person for the job, identifying their training gap, creating that training program for them, and then making a plan to capture and transfer the knowledge of that person before they leave the organization. And you can weave that knowledge management into your training program and hopefully set up a mentoring relationship in order to make it a very smooth transition. And finally, I know I said a lot of times throughout here that I can get you this information, I can show you this, I can send you this. And I think we're going to send you in the chat now a link to download some forms and templates if you're curious to, to see those examples and utilize those forms that we have created. And, if there's any other questions that you have, I'd be glad to answer them. So thank you all very much. And turn it back over to Jim.
Real quick, Jen, what is the best way for everyone to get in contact with you? Would it be email, LinkedIn?
Yeah, email would be great. I mean, also welcome to add me on LinkedIn. Either one, really. Yeah.
And what is your email, I guess? Your email address, just in case, Jen.
Sure. It's J and then GIA, N as in Nancy, N as in Nancy, O, S as in Sam, A at edsisolutions.com.
Perfect. We just have a lot of people commenting that they'd love to email you.
Okay, good. So yeah, EDSI, Edward David Sam Igloo, EDSI Solutions with an S on the end.com.
Perfect. And we'll send the email address to everybody in the chat box as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Jen. I appreciate that. It's a really thorough process. I can tell you I have led a number of C-level clients through that exact process, and we've had tremendous success with it. And I find that organizations always feel like they actually have a good plan, and they always feel really like confident that they're going to succeed if they follow the steps. So that's awesome, and thank you for sharing that, Jen. But there are also mistakes that are made along the way, and I want to share some of those. And this first one is the number one issue that we see in smaller organizations where there's a transfer of leadership. Oftentimes, it's a privately held, family-owned business, and mom or dad is transferring the business, or maybe they're going to retire, or God forbid, they pass away unexpectedly, and the leadership transfers to two or more of the children or other individuals. It's hard to make that decision to say, hey, Bobby, you are now going to be the president. And guess what, Sam, you're going to be reporting to Bobby. Those are hard discussions for parents to have with kids. And if they don't do that, chaos will ensue. I guarantee it. I had a client that was a family-owned business. It was started by a gentleman who then passed away, got ill, passed the business on to 4 of his children. None of them had the leadership role. There was no clarity about who was going to be responsible for what. We got called in because the company had degraded into a financial distress situation. And what was worse is not only was the company failing, but his 4 kids, 2 of them didn't speak to each other, and the rest of them all had bad relationships. They certainly wouldn't spend Thanksgiving together. It was just really, it devolved into something very ugly. And I'm sure that the father, if he were around today, would be really sad to see that his kids don't relate to one another. Some of them don't even talk to each other. And we had to go in and make some very hard decisions about who was going to lead the company. And it was simply because those hard decisions weren't made earlier. And so what we recommend is you have to pick one leader. You can't pick 2 leaders. 2 or more leaders just means that you're going to have 2 brains on the same body, and they're not always going to agree, and it's going to become dysfunctional. So we have to pick one. We have to make sure the roles and responsibilities are really clear. And we have to make sure that one person has the authority to make key decisions, which might mean firing other family members, or demoting, or changing their comp, whatever it might be. They need to have that authority. And if there are non-employee family members that feel that they're entitled to some of the earnings of the organization, and they're, maybe they've been left some percentage of the ownership, they should not be allowed to have any say in how the business is run, because all they do is the first time they're unhappy with their share of the earnings, they start to meddle in the business, and they undermine and they cause chaos. I've seen it many, many times. So don't do it. Make the hard decisions now. Pick a leader. Make sure everybody understands that leader, and make sure that they're empowered. The next thing is that the successor is not prepared to lead. Now, this applies not only to the CEO, but it also applies to many of the other C-level positions. The number one reason people fail, we all know of the Peter principle, right? Hey, this person was great until they got into that job. Well, apparently we promoted them too far. We promoted them beyond their capability. Well, guess what? They were promoted for a reason. They were promoted because they were doing a good job up until that point. And usually what we see is that the person was not prepared or trained for that particular role. I'm sure many of you can relate to this. When you think about great salespeople, how often do they make a great sales manager or a great vice president of sales, right? At the end of the day, they're very different skill sets from being a great salesperson to being a great sales leader. The same is true in engineering. It's true in finance, in accounting, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to make sure that they're prepared to lead and to take that next role. So as Jen said, in her process, you have to create a development plan to figure out what the gaps are for the successor, make sure that you address those gaps with training and knowledge. So what we recommend is the first thing is with any successor that's being considered, make sure they're committed to the role. I had a situation not long ago where I had a client that was bound and determined that his daughter was going to take over the company when he retired. Well, it was really clear to me that that was going to be a dicey call on his part. I sat down for a one-on-one with her, interviewed her, and she was very clear to me that she did not desire the role. She was not committed to the role. She had kids that she was raising on her own, and she did not want to be the one with all the pressure of running the company. She had really good reasons for why she didn't want to run the company, and she wasn't committed to it. So we were able to then ultimately move on and find the right successor for that role. But that person has to be committed to it, because there are a lot of great people that you may think want that next role, and they might have really good reasons why they don't. We also got to make sure we assess the skills, knowledge, and behaviors long before the transition. We also got to make sure that we capture and document the institutional knowledge, and then create a career path and a development plan to make sure they're ready to lead when they make that level. Here's one, mistake 3, and again, it kills me because I can't tell you how many times I've seen each of these. Successors are treated differently and they're not respected. This happens a lot in family businesses. It might be the son that everybody thinks is going to be the successor, and the son is given preferential treatment by the father or the mother, and they're just not respected because they're not working as hard, they're living by different rules, etc. So at the end of the day, you got to make sure that you don't show blatant favoritism if it's clear who the successor is or might be. You have to make sure that they're leading by example. So I grew up in a family business, and I remember one time actually getting pretty upset with my father. I was 17 at the time, and quitting. And I remember that night around the dinner table, my dad and I sat down, and I said, Dad, I just don't think it's fair. You treat us differently than you treat the other employees, and frankly, I feel like it's unfair to us because you're hard on us. And he basically said to me, he goes, Jim, I have to be that way with you and your siblings, because otherwise the other employees won't respect you. You need to lead by example. You need to be the first ones there in the morning. You need to be the ones that are working harder than other people. That was a great lesson to me. And unfortunately, that's not a lesson that a lot of business owners teach their own children or heir apparent, because they often, instead of holding them to a higher standard, they lower the bar, and that creates all kinds of other issues for the organization. Lack of clear rules. We had a situation. This is a Brazilian company, about a $600 million company. They had multiple plants. The son of the Brazilian owner was going to take over the North American business unit. He worked out of their biggest plant here in the United States, and he essentially basically made his own rules. He would, well, first of all, he would rob the company bank account by doing things like buying himself a brand new car. He would show up when he wanted. He took unlimited vacation. I could go on, and it was pretty appalling. And frankly, that lack of clear rules that he had created chaos in the organization. He ultimately had to be removed from the North American operations because he was so underappreciated by the rest of the American workers. And I'm trying to be polite here, but basically they didn't want him, right? And the father kind of figured it out and realized that he had been taking advantage of making up his own rules and forcing everybody else to live by the company rules that he didn't live by. So again, don't show favoritism, don't allow non-performance, and really, when you have key successors, you should always make sure that they need to understand that they need to lead by example. And things like simple things like work hours, expense reporting, acceptable and unacceptable behaviors need to be very, very clear. They need to be black and white because you want these people to be respected when they go into that next role. Last thing, in terms of mistakes, watch for the poisonous divides or cultural misfits. My old company, we had one individual who was a very high performer, had been promoted multiple times, and he was universally disliked in the organization. He then ultimately was promoted to run that particular division. And the division, in a very short period of time, lost a large number of key people and began to fade financially. And they actually started to decline precipitously. And they ended up firing this individual. Well, he was a total cultural misfit, and he never should have been put in the role in the first place. So you can have high performers that you think are going to be, great leaders because they've done well in the past, but be very, very careful. And especially if you've got individuals in the private entity, in a private organization where maybe they're family members that don't get along, be very careful with that. Either have them figure out a way to get along and support one another, or one or both of them typically needs to leave the organization. So I always just advise, don't hire the troublemakers or with those with relationship issues. If they do have them, fix those issues quickly. Don't let them fester. If those continue, right, somebody has to go. And then just be careful with the high performers that are cultural misfits. So with that, I want to talk about the importance of gaining buy-in for a minute before we go to Q&A. At the end of the day, succession planning, especially at the C level, is critically important to the long-term success, financial viability, growth, and strategic success of any organization. But it takes time, it takes effort, it's going to take some money, it's going to take real commitment to making it happen, right? And the problem with succession planning is always this. It's I shouldn't say always, it's mostly we have a situation where, gosh, this person is going to retire in 3 years or 5 years. Okay, it always seems to be something that we can put off until a later date. And what usually happens then is suddenly somebody gets sick, somebody decides to retire unexpectedly, and then you have to rush to get the replacement in place. And we haven't done the appropriate work to make sure they've been developed so that they're going to be at their optimum potential when they go into that role. So it's critically important that you get buy-in, especially from the CEO or owner, and that they understand how important this is. Because look, what I see on the private company side is a lot of times you may have an owner of a company, let's say it's got 200 employees, and the owner, the vast majority of his or her wealth is tied up in that organization. And almost always, the company is sold to the employees, a leader, or maybe transition to the next generation. And usually the sales process means that the owner that has sold it or transitioned the business gets paid out over time. And here's what's terrible, right? If that company then begins to become dysfunctional and fails, that owner who has spent most of their life building that company and most of their wealth is tied up in that company, they may never get that out of it, right? They may never get paid out simply because the company failed. So it's critically important that they understand that, look, I know this isn't a fire that's burning today, but it could be the biggest fire burning tomorrow if we're not careful. And we have to address it now, because it takes sometimes years to get the successors developed and ready for that next role. So buy-in at the leadership point, I can't stress how important that is. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Rebecca, where we can maybe field some questions that may be coming in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim and Jen. I loved your webinar. I was taking lots of notes. This is excellent, excellent stuff. Before we go into Q&A, I do want to mention, I understand if our audience, anybody in the audience needs to run, but just remember that we are recording this session and we will email you a copy of the recording and a PDF of the slides within 48 hours. Before we dive into questions, Human Resources Today actually has some really exciting news. We are currently running the Most Valuable Post Awards. If you're interested in participating in the MVP Awards and you want to learn more, check out the link in the chat box. Perfect. So let's go through some questions. We have a lot coming in, Jim and Jen. So it's going to be a really awesome Q&A session. So the first question comes from Sean. Sean is asking, should you identify more than one internal successor for a position? If you only identify one, what do you do if after all that investment, that person decides to leave?
Yeah, we always advise to try to come up with at least two candidates for each role so you can compare them. As Jen said, you want to do an assessment, a gap analysis, to see how they stack up to the success profile. Because you're right, Rebecca, gosh, sometimes people leave. Sometimes you have somebody that you've identified, and at the 11th hour, they leave the company. So you better have more than one. Pick the best one, right, and develop them, but usually try to pick more than one. And it's also surprising that the individual, the person that will be leaving, right, the C-level person that'll be leaving, they often will be really strong at identifying 2 or 3 candidates that would be ideal. We did some work with a very, very large company that's a consumer products company here in the US. And there was an individual that was retiring, and everybody thought person A was the logical successor. But this individual said, no, it's not person A, it's person B, and here's why. And he had excellent reasons for it. We did the analysis of both person A and person B, and he was absolutely right that person B was the one that we should be looking at. So long answer, but please, yes, always try to look at 2 or 3 candidates for each critical role.
Excellent. Thanks for that amazing answer, Jim. That answer kind of feeds a little bit into the next question that I have as a follow-up. This is from Tracy. She's asking, so which personality profiles would you recommend then?
You know what? There's so many good ones out there, Tracy. I would advise look at PI, look at DISC, look at AI, Acumax Index. Look, it really comes down to you're going to look at them and you're going to say some of them take more work than others. Some of them are far more expensive than others. My advice is pick 2 or 3 and look at them and see which one is going to best fit your organization.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's very vast, so it just really depends on the organization. I think that's a really great point to drive home, Jim. So this question is for Jen. It's from Alyssa, and she is asking for some more examples from step 1 for how to determine the criticality of a role. So I guess they're just kind of wondering those descriptor factors of what a 5 means versus a 3.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I have some more questions that I can send over to you. It's quite a series of questions that you can go through. So I can possibly email that over. I don't know if you have any experience or anything to add on that, Jim.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at the criticality factors, there's a pretty pretty detailed rating system. So to get into that now might be a little bit difficult. But yeah, send the email to Jen, and she can actually send over one of the rating systems that we use.
Excellent. Yes. And I believe that we have included Jen's email in the chat box. So if you'd like to email her, go ahead. We'll also have the contact information for Jim as well, in case you'd like to reach out to him also. So the next question that we have comes from Aaron. And Aaron is saying, does the same mantra of success planning work for large corporations?
Yeah. So the difficulty, so some of the basic mistakes that we see made in privately held and smaller organizations, surprisingly, we don't see a few of them in larger corporations, but what we see is um, a lot of issue in the larger corporations in terms of them just not really going through the process. It just is like it's, hey, here's the obvious thing we ought to do, and they just do it. And we see a lot of failures that aren't as obvious, right? You're not going to, if you're a Fortune 500 company and you have one executive that goes into a role, other than the CEO, that goes into a high level position and they fail, it probably won't bring the company down, but it will create a lot of chaos and it will hurt the company's ability to achieve its goals, et cetera. So we do see a lot of the issues in bigger companies. I see, I get frustrated when I see them just not wanting to follow the process, or not wanting to put the time and energy into making it happen properly. But we have seen large companies fail because they put the wrong leader in place. The wrong CEO can be absolutely devastating. I live in the Detroit area, and the Ford Motor Company has gone through a transition where they had a CEO that was beloved, phenomenal. They currently have one that has changed really all of their strategic direction, et cetera. And it's had a dramatically negative impact on their stock price, on their organization. There have been a lot of layoffs, and now they're kind of righting the ship again. So we can see very dramatic things happen in the large organizations. So just you got to go through the process and make sure you do it right, because otherwise it can have all kinds of long-term lingering impacts.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. I love the applicability of that from small to large. And that actually feeds into the next question. This is from Julie, and she's saying, in a small company under 50 employees, what if you can't identify an internal successor?
Well, that's a great question. Look, that's very often the case in small companies. So don't just put somebody in there because it's the son or the daughter or the employee that's been there for 20 years, right? If they're going to fail, go to the outside. Or it might be, and so there's two things. One, go to the outside. The other is you might have the right heir apparent, but that person is not ready yet, right? They might be 10 years away, and the owner may say, hey, I've got 1 or 2 years left in me. We call it the bridge CEO. Bring in a bridge CEO, somebody that can be there for 5 to 7 years, that can mentor the heir to make sure that they're ready. So going to the outside is often a really, really good strategy.
Awesome. Yeah, that's excellent. I think, there's a lot of startups out there and whatnot, and there's just, there's not as big as a pool to pull from. Um, so I think that's an excellent answer. Thank you so much, Jim. So this question, I think we have time for one more. This question is from Divya, and they're saying, hello. What should be the approach for communicating the identified successor? How do you manage the possible demotivating impact on those who are not identified as the successors?
Wow, what a great question. That's an issue, right? At the end of the day, there are always going to be some individuals that may be disappointed, right? That's unfortunately the reality, and that does happen. So I always encourage, when Jen walked you through the process, I encourage people to say, look, we're going through a process. Here's the process. And so the decision will be based on best fit to the success profile, right? So when you get to that point, you may have person A who has been selected and person B who was not selected. I think it's really important to share with person B how the decision was made, what the maybe why the gap was larger for them, and what are those areas that they can work on so that they're going to be open to maybe the next promotion or the next opportunity for a C-level position. And look, in very large corporations, we see it all the time, right? I mean, General Electric is probably the perfect example. When you see somebody selected as the next CEO at GE, here's what happens. There's normally 4 or 5 other critical executives that leave the organization, and they go and they seed other organizations, and they typically do very well, right? But you do want to communicate it. And if you're a big organization and you do lose somebody because of it, you can look at that as a blessing and a curse, right? You didn't want to lose them, but then you've also then just created a new opportunity for somebody else to be promoted and be developed in your organization.
Wow, what a great answer, and what an excellent answer to end on. I love that. Definitely all encompassing and really helps synthesize the entire presentation. All right, guys. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. I hope you all had half as much fun as I did. Thanks to our sponsor, Paycor, our wonderful speakers, Jim Bitterly and Jen Genosa, and all of you for attending. I'm Rebecca, and you can find Human Resources Today on Twitter at HR Posts. Please reach out to Jim and Jen on LinkedIn. We do have Jen's email, and I believe, Jim, would you like to also give out your email, or would you rather them reach out to you on LinkedIn?
Sure. Yeah, my email is jbitterly, so JBITTERLE at edsisolutions.com. And oh, by the way, don't, if you're looking at trying to create the unquittable organization, please go to Amazon and buy the book. It just launched last week, and so it's available now.
Oh, yes, and we have sent the link to that. It's an amazing resource, honestly. It's everything that Jim's talked about today. It's the guide for the most effective tools, strategies, and processes for attracting, developing, and retaining talent in your organizations. So can't push this enough. Definitely check out the book. It is super awesome. So thank you both so much. If anybody in the audience wants to reach out to Jim and Jen, here's some more of their information. But yes, that's all the time that we have for today. And thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.